So, welcome back from the coffee break. Our next presentation is from Stefan, and he is talking about anti-forensics. So, without further ado, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So, thank you. Yeah, you can clap, you don't have to. No, it's okay. Yeah, exactly. Thanks for attending this talk. Even if it's beautiful outside, it's blazing hot, so maybe you prefer to stay here in the shadow, but thanks for coming anyway. So my name is Stefan. I do incident response for a living since a couple of years, since 10 plus years. I'm doing just in digital forensics, hunting hackers through networks, doing malware analysis and all that stuff. When I'm not, I'm a lot. I spend a lot of hours in front of a computer. If I don't spend that much time in front of a computer, I like hiking. I love being outside. I also do regularly and frequently tweet, post on social media and stuff, and also I do blogging from time to time. So if you want to check it out, my blog is written there. The most important part, or at least it's important for that presentation, is I kind of differentiate the slides between blue team, red team, and purple team, because the title of the talk is "You're Doing It Wrong," because I'm coming from a blue team perspective. I showcase like how do I, as a digital forensicator, find your stuff you've done on a system, even if you try to hide your stuff or your tracks. And then I said, okay, when I would be an attacker, maybe I would do it this way, but then again, I have chances again to catch you. So it's just kind of a cat and mouse game, as you will see later on. But let's get started. The fun thing is the idea of that talk came to my mind, and I remember when I was younger, that was in my teenage years, when I first came across that paper here. It's called How to Cover Your Tracks from The Hacker's Choice. Franhauser, maybe some of you know that name. The Hacker's Choice is still pretty famous in cyberspace. They frequently release tools. But the interesting part was when I read that paper first in the 90s, it was 98 or 99 when I came across that paper, I couldn't understand a thing. They were talking about how to delete log files on a Linux system, how to cover your tracks. And rereading the papers in 25 was mind-blowing for me, because I saw the techniques, or I read about techniques which were published in the 90s and were still valid up to date. So even threat groups today are using the same techniques they used in the 90s. And funny thing is, I also gave a talk about Linux rootkits. You find it on YouTube, on different conferences, and it's the same thing there on Linux rootkits. Like techniques the attackers used in the 2000s, they're still using these techniques in 25. So sometimes I really losing hope for us as defenders, as blue teamers, because it seems that we are lagging behind all the time. So the attackers are just too good. I don't think the attackers are too good. We are not paying enough attention, or we maybe are not looking in the right spots, as we will see in the later on slides. One of the things is, when I started, so I really sound like a boomer here, because I repeatedly, when I started in InfoSec, but I have gray hair, so maybe I'm a bit older. The funny thing is that OSCP style try-harder, that was really reflected in my teens, because there wasn't like a lot or an overload of IT security content on YouTube. No IPSec, no whatever, no tutorials. It was really just grinding through the manuals, learning step by step. And that taught me a lot. I don't say it's better, but I think the bar to enter the field, be it as a blue teamer or red teamer, was significantly lowered over the years. That means when I talk to customers, because I'm a consultant, and I'm also spending way too much time just talking to clients. And when I say to them is, even like a 13-year-old boy or girl could hack your server, because when a critical vulnerability came out, public code was or is most of the time just released a few hours later. So attackers or just researchers, they publish code on the internet, everybody can download the code, everybody can breach your systems, right? So that's the same here. I do not have to have a strong knowledge about anti-forensic techniques, about forensic artifacts. All I have to do is Google something up, go to GitHub, download some tool. Maybe you trust the tool, maybe you don't, who cares? Just run it, and then hopefully the blue team will not detect you. I personally, when I read something like this, can be used to test the capabilities of your incident response forensic teams, I think to myself, challenge accepted, because I think I will still catch you. So how to cover your tracks? Coming back to that one. Plain and simple, just delete the file. Because, like I said, I do incident response for a living. What attackers are doing frequently when they breach the network, they move laterally through the network, and they delete their tracks, meaning their files along the way. Files could be anything like files for exfiltration, configuration files with password in it. They use to exfiltrate the data to it, rclone, Mega, for example, PowerShell scripts, executables, stagers, whatever. They try to cover the tracks. So, but the important and interesting thing here is NTFS, the file system on Windows, have a feature called master file table. Every file in the master file table have an identifier, the MFT ID. Thing is, when you delete a file in Windows, it just gets marked as deleted. It does not get automatically deleted. That's the thing. Even when I, as an attacker, go to, like with the Windows Explorer, I delete my file, I go to the paper bin, and the recycle bin, and I deleted it there. It's not deleted. It might be deleted for you as an attacker, but for me as a forensicator, that is a chance to catch you. So we are using a tool called Velociraptor a lot. It's a screenshot from Velociraptor. I will also use different screenshots from that tool. It's an open source incident response tool, forensic tool. If you have not heard of it, it's super powerful. You find it on the internet. What I'm doing here is, in that cases, because I found traces of rclone, so the attacker used rclone to exfiltrate data out to a different server in the internet. rclone needs a configuration file in certain circumstances. I know that, and now what I'm doing here is I'm searching for a file called rclone.conf on this master file table. And surprisingly, this is one is from a real case. So you see the blue ribbon on the left corner. I found traces of that file inside the MFT. With Velociraptor, there is another thing called NTFS recover. I'm passing as an argument to that hunt, to that Velociraptor hunt, the MFT ID. So the ID of that master file table record to recover the file. And surprisingly, I get back a plain text pass or a plain text text file with the credentials in it. Even if the attacker deleted the file, I'm still able to recover it based on the MFT. And what's interesting, I gave that talk yesterday at the first conference in Copenhagen. And after my talk, somebody from a real big worldwide company, a security analyst, approached me and said, I was not aware of that feature. And I said to him, but you are investing breaches in your company, right? You are a forensic examiner, a forensic analyst. And he said, yeah, that's right. And then you see the gap. So maybe I just thought about Donald Rumsfeld, was it, who coined that phrase, the unknown unknown. So if you're not aware as a security analyst of that feature, you might miss out a ton in your forensic analysis. Now comes the purple slide. So I thought to myself, okay, well, it's not enough just to delete files on a system. What else can we do as an attacker? So now I'm speaking as a purple teamer, as a red teamer. There's this thing called sdelete. It comes pre-packed with the sysinternal suite of Process Explorer, autoruns, etc. Also sdelete. Funny thing is, and sometimes I criticize that because our blue team community likes to repeat stuff. Nobody is really think outside the box most of the time, because we see that here. The blog post from Investor Ecos and one of the blog posts from Hack the Box, which was quite recently, so they just keep repeating all the stuff. And I'm speaking as a red teamer, as an attacker. When you try to hide your tracks, to cover your tracks, I personally would not use sdelete because it's highly flagged by AVs, and you still leave traces inside the MFT, as we will see later on. That tool here has a particular signature when deleting files, and you still find traces of that when doing an investigation. So what I thought was, hey, why not do it yourself? And turns out it's surprisingly easy to cover your tracks when you know exactly what you're doing. With these couple of slides of PowerShell, I can overwrite the data on a file system multiple times, and I change the name multiple times. So even if I could know as a forensic examiner that somebody used rclone, that rclone.conf, in my case here, I could not recover plain text out of it. And most of the time, I'm sure these little slides here or these lines of code will not get flagged by AV, will not get flagged by an EDR, and you can simply hide your traces. Easy enough. But there is more deleted files fun. The screenshot is from a blog post from Volexity, the American-based incident response company, pretty famous. They investigated a breach, and they found out that the attackers use also a tool, a native Windows tool called Cypher. And Cypher has the ability to overwrite data that has been deleted so that it can be recovered or accessed. So, sounds great, right? So, but in most of the time, so when we are doing incident response, sometimes it's just enough to know that a tool was run on a system. You don't have to exactly know what the tool were doing or the exact content of the file. Just for building a timeline, it might be enough that you know that somebody ran that script or ran that tool. Because then you have evidence that the attacker touched your system, right? So that's why I've written here sometimes it's enough to find evidence of execution. Another really, really neat feature of Windows is called the USN, also known as the journal. The journal keeps track of every file modification, renaming, deleting, or whatever you are doing. So just to recap here, we have the master file table, which keeps track of all your files in Windows. And there is another thing called a journal. So every time I create a file, I rename a file, I move a file, that gets reflected in the USN journal. Exactly as I've written here, it really depends about how active a system is. That could be from hours to minutes to months where you find traces of it. I frequently tell my teams, I frequently tell colleagues, do not miss out searching the USN for traces of attackers. What we are seeing here is also from a live case I worked on. On the upper hand, we see an installation of a service, of a malicious service. So what the attacker did, he downloaded a file called PNG something on a system and installed it as with run DLL as a service. What's really matter here is I know the time the service was created, but I might not know the time the PNG file was landed on disk. Searching the journal for the file name yielded the exact date when the file landed on disk. Which means I can track back the attacker. So maybe the service time doesn't correspond with the time the file was downloaded to disk or was written to disk, and you might have a time gap in your timeline. It's really about just correlating all the pieces you see. Do not trust fully the event logs, search for other traces from the attackers. However, now we're coming back to the purple slide. The first comment you see here below on the slide, that fsutil USN delete journal, I can delete the journal. The first screenshot here, artifacts with results 24, that was the thing I did in my test lab. So I searched it for a name of a program or a script I tested, and then I got back 24 hits, which I could use in my forensic analysis, of course. When I deleted the journal, I got back 0 hits. So as an attacker, I could use that technique to cover my tracks. One evidence less for us as incident response consultants. However, that's also pretty known, I would say, in the forensic incident response community, because also Elastic Security have written about that, delete volume USN journal with fsutil. I also frequently tell customers and incident responder, or if you are part of a security team of a company, I might have a look if that technique would raise an alert in your network. Just type it in on your network if you have an EDR sensor or if you are using Sysmon with a CM or whatever. Does that get raised as an alarm? Because if it does not, I will create an alarm, so an alert of that, because how common is that somebody really is deleting the journal? I would say nobody does that. Not even a system administrator would have like a good reason to delete the journal. So if you are seeing this comment in your network, that might be a really good chance that somebody is inside your network. Yes, looking at different stuff here. One also of the really cool techniques, and one of my favorite artifacts, most to say, in Windows is the System Resource Usage Monitor. I would also say a lot of people, even if you're working in the field, have not heard of that term. But it's super important that you look at that stuff, as we will see in the next slide. That SRAM, that System Resource Usage Monitor database, keeps track of different things of your programs, be it like network usage, foreground, time, etc. So even if, like Forenzia said, I will purge as much traces as possible, you might find still traces on the attacker there. Because let's see why that's so cool. This one here, also from a live case, that write86.exe, that was an exfiltration tool by the attackers. The attacker was clever. We saw some traces on the firewall. We knew that the attacker exfiltrated data out of the network because, latency and etc. So on the firewall, you saw that multiple gigabytes, terabytes were exfiltrated on the firewall. So we knew that the attacker used a tool or something. Now let's say the attacker just deleted all his tools, as we saw. Just delete it, rename it, sdelete, or with Cypher. Then again, what can you do? What I did was searching the MFT, searching the master file table, no results, bummer. Searching the USN, no results, bummer. What else I can do? I can have a look in the SRAM database, and I found traces there. So again, if you think as an attacker, I'm clever, and I delete all my traces, you might still miss an artifact, a forensic artifact, and we as defender, we as blue teamer, we might have a chance to find you. Now comes the red slide again, because it's easy to stop that SRAM database for collecting data. One command is enough. Just do an sc stop DPS and sc config DPS start disabled, and these logs here, which I use, will not be written to that disk. And then I thought, okay, that might be too noisy because I want to create a purple team slide, which just the exact command I could use to carve out my maliciousness of the SRAM database. And then I went ahead and I asked ChatGPT, hey, could you help me achieving that one? So give me code which might do that. And ChatGPT said, yeah, of course I can do that. It's here. And ChatGPT says table to scan, and assuming app name or application ID fields contains the keyword. And then I asked ChatGPT, are you certain about that code? Do you know the SRAM database? And he said, yeah, sure thing, go ahead. So it turns out it's more complicated than that, of course. Personally, I think we as IT security folks or just security folks, we might have a good future here, even with AI, even with ChatGPT. Because it turns out ChatGPT have no and zero clue about the database format of that SRAM database. ChatGPT was just assuming something. What we are seeing here, the table doesn't make sense, the keywords doesn't make sense, it's all hex encoded, and it needs more work to do so that you can really scrub the database with all the things you want to get rid of. That code here from ChatGPT might be easy, but not as easy for an attacker to really use. So as an attacker, I still must work harder to achieve my goals. Not saying this is impossible, but still, the attackers must raise the bar. Time stomping, maybe a term some of you have heard. time stomping is really about just changing the times of files, of executables to blend in. We as incident responders, we as forensicators, we love to create timelines, right? Everything must be in timeline, everything must be UTC, so that we can really track the attackers. And we also love to search during time frames. So we knew that the attacker was present in the network for the last 7 days. What I'm doing as a forensic examiner, I search the file system for the last 7 days. So as an attacker, I might be clever and I think, okay, I just backdate the time 2 weeks after that period. So my search will not find anything. For the upcoming slides, it's important that you realize it's more complicated than that, because that's why I've written disclaimer, this is not the full picture of timestamp of NTFS. It's a bit more complicated, but keep in mind, so the gist of it, the takeaway of that slide is that we in Windows, in NTFS, we have 2 sort of timestamps. One is the standard information timestamp, one is the file name timestamp. So the standard information time is the modification time, the creation file, the dates you see with Windows Explorer. When you hover over a file, then you see like modification date, when it was created, etc. I can modify these dates as a user. However, I cannot modify the file name timestamp. This was prevented years ago with the introduction of PatchGuard. So as an attacker, I cannot really tamper with these files, right? So this is good for us as defenders, because we can say, if, like you see here from the presentation from Rob Lee, if the SC creation time is older than the FN creation time, then you might have somebody tampering with your files, doing some time stamping. Because again, as an attacker, I can adjust the SI, the standard information timestamp, but I cannot change the FN timestamp. And this might give us a hint that somebody is like present in your network, doing some malicious stuff, or at least trying to hide their presence on the network. Velociraptor, again, that open source tool I mentioned several times before. We see here a nice example of that one. So on the left-hand side, I see the birth time from the standard information time, 2023. On the right-hand side, I see the file name birth time. And this one, it was in 25. So clearly we have something odd here, because it cannot be that one birth time is younger than the other, right? And Velociraptor pointed that really nicely out with a clock on the left corner. So it turns out it might be easy to find something on your system. Just search for that stuff, right? And then now comes really the funny part. Fun fact, if you also want to timestamp the file name timestamps, you can just rename the file and rename it back. Windows will copy the timestamps from the SE attribute to the file name when renaming the file. Yeah, it was crazy. When I first read that, I couldn't believe it. But it turns out, as an attacker, I can control the SI timestamp. Right, I can control that. And then I just go ahead and do so rename.txt, rename back.txt, and those both file names are the same. And all your time-stomping detection techniques will no longer working. And this one is really great because Rob Lee, that's really a big name in the incident response community in digital forensic, because all the presentations, all the courses, digital forensic classes, they teach that all the time, because it's impossible to do the FN, whatever to do, but it's still possible. As an attacker, I could use that technique and be successful. Nobody will find me when just searching for that SI, FN timestamp difference. PowerShell. I love PowerShell logs. If you're following me on social media, you know that I'm really geeking about PowerShell logs. I'm preaching it all the time. Enable PowerShell script log logging because it's such a cool thing. Besides script log logging, there's another thing called console history. Turns out, every time you, as an attacker, or you as a red teamer, or whatever, open a PowerShell command prompt, all you type into that console, that gets saved into a file called console history. Responsible for that one is the PS readline module, and we use that feature a lot in our incident response cases. Because, as you see here, it's also from a live case, we see exactly the exfiltration steps the attacker did to exfiltrate the data. So he's searching for files, he's creating zip archives or just archives to later exfiltrate those files in the network. This is really a gold mine for an examination of a system, for forensic examination of that system. If you don't know or haven't known about the PS readline or the console history, you are really missing out because we check it all the time. And we are really successful in these cases. Red slide. Turns out, again, it's really easy just to disable all these login mechanisms. What you can do is, with PowerShell, set PS readline option history save pad and just put it to somewhere, because Velociraptor or your DFIR tool, your incident response tool, is certainly looking for a fixed location for that file. If that file is not in that fixed location your tool is searching for, it just doesn't return results, right? You might not even notice that your tool doesn't return results. So that might be an option. Additionally, it's possible to turn off logging this file. Could do. These comments might be also something you want to check out. If you do command line login and alerting on command lines, this might be some comments you want to flag, because who else is tampering with the history files? Maybe a developer, maybe a system administrator. I would bet in most cases it's something malicious, because again, this is not something you do on day-to-day operations. And also Elasticsearch, I love the Elastic repository on GitHub. They are doing such a cool job in just open sourcing detection logic. I personally browse that GitHub almost weekly, because just to get some fresh ideas about looking new techniques, just trying to learn something new. And then we see here Elastic Security, the EDR or the CM also got us covered, because they have like file where event action deletion and file name console history. So if somebody will delete that console history file, that will raise an alert when you're losing Elastic. Purple slides, that whole discussion is a bit more complicated and we have time here, but if you are working as a red teamer or maybe like a pen tester, you certainly have heard of disabling ETW. So the ETW providers, they provide the event log service with data, and it's super, super powerful. And then as a red teamer, I personally would just silence these providers. So the Turla, the famous APT, the famous Russian APT group, there's just a code example here from a sample. They use that techniques in the wild. It's still kind of research, because last week or 2 weeks ago, somebody published a new technique to silence all these ETW providers. And this will be most probably my way of doing it, because you can do it in memory, you can do it pretty stealthy. Because an attacker, this might be here just a newbie mistake. I just go ahead on the file system and I just delete the file, which might raise or get picked up by command line login or by an EDR. This here might be your stealthier approach. Right. So, halftime, and we are switching to Linux, bang on time. So this was the Windows part. Now the rest of the presentation is just Linux part. When reading blog posts, I love reading blog posts, because every time I'm reading blog posts, in my mind, I really skim the text and I try to think, how would I detect these techniques? Is it possible to detect these with event logs, with regular log files and not? And then I came across this one here. So they say, Mandiant say, so we investigated this Linux host or this Linux appliance. What the attackers did, they cleared the kernel messages using a command called dmessage. And you see dmessage -c will clear the kernel message log buffer. Why is that important? Because, for example, when you are installing a new module into the Linux kernel that get written to that Linux kernel buffer. Logins, etc., doing stuff on a kernel level gets written to that D message, that kernel ring buffer. So the attackers in that case, they thought, okay, I'm clever, I just clear the ring buffer and then I'm gone. So you see that technique here. So the first D message prints out a line on my test system. I installed a malicious rootkit on my test system, and the kernel said, hey, something is amiss here, because loading out of 3 module taints kernel, and this is a bad signature we are seeing here. This is something we want to check out. So if you are seeing that message on your Linux system, somebody installed a non-signed kernel module, exactly. But what I did then was I used that technique, that D message minus C, and suddenly no messages. So I, as a system administrator, I log into my system, I do MD message, and I see nothing. And I said, yeah, okay, of course, good job, attackers. Is that enough? No, turns out not. So here is the catch again. As an attacker, you might think you are clever. You might think, hey, I just deleting all the kernel message buffer, and then the job is done. Turns out, no. These kernel messages are also stored in a file called kern.log. And I think I, as a forensic examiner, as an incident responder, I find the exact same information I found or I will found in the message buffer inside that file. So even if an attacker clears one evidence, I still have a second evidence. I can find you and I can trace you back. Additionally, or let's say the attacker is also clever and think, okay, I'm doing D message minus C, and then I'm also clearing that kern.log file. I still have the journal, which I will find information about you as an attacker. The journal is also one big log file. Most Linux, if not all modern Linux operating systems, they're using something called a journal. It's not the same as the journal in Windows. The journal in Linux is just like a collection of every log file written by the system. Well, not every log file, but most of the common log files are written in the journal, and we can search the journal. What I'm doing here, I search the kernel for I'm searching the journal for kernel messages, and voila, I still get the same information back. So the thing is, the key takeaway is, even if Mandiant say, hey, the attackers were using anti-forensic techniques, they cleared the D message buffer, I still have a lot of other traces I could use. And that's the whole thing about that whole presentation here. That's really the key takeaway. Even if you think the attacker cleared their tracks, they cleared evidence on a system, I'm sure there are more than one trace they left behind which were not cleared behind them. Then I think, okay, journal is the latest, greatest. And then I thought to myself, how about just clearing the journal? Because the journal is such a treasure trove for us forensic analysts. Maybe I want to trash that. And also here from Mandiant again, so they called it Steel Corgi, that tool. It's clear that the use of the bleach parameter during an intrusion results in hard times for the DFIR team. The gist of that article is that the attackers tried to remove as much traces as possible. So we see here syslog, messages, secure, outlog, all these files we will need to say if somebody logged into the system, outlog, tracks all the accepted or denied authentications on the system and not. But again, here, if the attacker said, hey, I delete all these files, I, as an incident responder, can come here, and we still have the journal like we see before. The journal also keeps track of all the authentications, of all the denies, who logged in, from which source IP address, from which port, right? But now we come to the purple slide again. I can delete the journal. What we are seeing here is I can rotate the journal and I can remove these traces from the journal. Then you see like deleted archived journal, so 600 MB of files were deleted. This might be a smart move from an attacker, because as we saw in the latest or in the last slides, as an attacker or as a forensic examiner, so when I'm investigating a system, I'm using the journal a lot. The journal gives us a lot of information about loaded modules, about authentications and not. So this one here might be not the best, but one of the good steps an attacker could do to remove as much possible or as much traces as possible. However, now the blue team slide again, clearing logs generates, well, other logs. If I would try to clear the journal from a Linux system, that will in turn generate other log files. So we see that here, vacuum done, archive formal, rotate journal. If you are collecting log files from a Linux server, this might stand out here. And I'm saying if that stands out, because again, using the Elastic archive, so the Elastic GitHub repository here, they do not have, at least Elastic do not have a detection for that journal CTL command, as we saw here. Personally, I think that might be also something you want to check out when working for an internal security team or just doing forensic work or doing endpoint detection or whatever, because that comment, how common is it? Because most of the time when we are talking about finding evil on a network, it's about how common is a command. Is it like everybody use a command multiple times a day? Then it might be bad for a detection engineering from a detection engineering perspective. But if such a command like this one is so infrequent in your organization, then I personally will probably just create an alarm for that one. Now to something cool, not. I mean, it's MFD create is just the pendant to the fileless technique we know in Windows. So in Windows, as in Linux, there are these fileless attacks I could use to download something from the internet and just run it in memory. Like run some PowerShell code directly from the internet, I download it, and then I just run it in memory, right? I can do the same in Linux, and it's pretty popular because we see that here, just an example that it's used in the wild. So that company with just blogged about PLUs, Python-based fileless malware targets cloud workloads to deliver crypto miner, and they called it, and I think that's kind of a bad and a silly term, fileless malware, because even also on Windows we use that term fileless all the time. It's not fileless, something lives on our system. Even if base 64 code lives in the registry, we have traces on the file system, right? Even if something is started from the command line and injected into memory, it's still something must do the job, the heavy lifting of bringing that stuff into our memory. So again, when I read that blog post, so I came across these two sentences here. So why threat actors use fileless attacks? First of all, harder to detect. Okay. Second, harder to investigate. And then every time I'm reading something, at least that's maybe me, but then I think, is that really true? Because I question a lot of these things we take for granted, and sometimes I think that's really the problem we, and I'm speaking as a blue teamer, have. We take so much as granted. I had a really a heated debate with something in Copenhagen which said it's impossible to find APTs in your network. And I said, heck no, it's not impossible, because they also leave traces. They must run their shellcode. They must stage something to get into memory. They must do something on your disk, and that something leave traces on the disk. And he said, no, you are wrong. And I said, okay. We come back to that, harder to detect, harder to investigate. Just, you don't have to read the code, it's just showcasing that it's super simple to really load a program into memory. So what we are seeing here is a Python program, so Python code, which takes an executable from Linux. It's called, I forget it. It's just putting out some quotes. It's a random binary from Linux pre-installed in Windows and Linux. What it's doing is it's taking that binary and run it into memory, which might be harder to detect, harder to investigate. Turns out also that the hacker's choice, so the company we talked in the first slide about cover your tracks, they also released a new tool. It's called Linux Binary Runtime Crypter, 100% in memory. Why is that good? Is that really good? Because if something is in memory running in Linux, is it really that harder to investigate and to detect? If you are really interested in that subject, I gave a talk together with my team colleague last year at B-Sides Munich. It's called /proc for security analysts, and it goes in really depth about how powerful that /proc file system in Linux is. If you would never have heard of /proc, you might want to really look it up. Because, as we will see, /proc is a virtual file system in Linux, and every process you load in Linux get his unique directory in that /proc file system. So within Linux, it's /proc, /process ID, /subdirectories. And these subdirectories are super, super important when you're doing Linux investigations and Linux forensic work. This slide here is from that B-Sides presentation. What you have to look at here is we went to a we went to /proc/PID, that 271580, and then we see an executable. Every process that gets started in Linux gets put into that executable folder within Linux. So as an attacker, I can start a program in Linux, and I can delete that file. So that's not the same as in Windows. As long as the program is running, I cannot delete it. I can delete it under Linux, and it still keeps running. However, it turns out here, and that's what's so funny here, and this is also kind of a fileless technique, even if the file is not backed on disk, you see it in the screenshot here, it leaves the mark deleted. And that's super, super easy to spot. You just have to search the /proc/PID/exe directory for the keyword deleted, and I will find your fileless memory attack. So coming back to that slide here, harder to detect? No. Harder to investigate? They say once detected, the fact that the payload lives in memory, it lives in memory, obviously, complicates the analysis process. Turns out I just can do a cp exe/temp/filename, recover filename, and I have the original binary back. It's easy as that. So fileless memory attacks in Linux are most of the time pretty easy to investigate. Then again, then I thought, now comes the red slide, and I thought to myself, there must be a better way. So how can I prevent that the executable gets so easy just to copy out from a blue perspective? How can I circumvent this easy technique? And then I stumbled about a thing called the Linux loader. So the dynamic linker on Linux, also known as the loader. What the loader does in the background, when you start a program in Linux, automatically the loader will jump in and do all the building blocks about shared memory, shared libraries and stuff, so that all your system calls, all your functions which are shared, like write and network connections, will function properly. Turns out I can pass the file name, so the file pass as a parameter to that loader, as you see here. So /lib/liblinux so2, that's the loader. On the right-hand side, as a parameter, comes my file name. That's my legitimate binary or my malicious binary I want to hide from the blue team. As you see, that binary runs without problems. So I can start my binary with the help of the loader. And this is important, because when I'm now trying to do the same trick, so I go to /proc/PID/exe, the executable doesn't point to my file on disk or my deleted file. The executable points to the loader. And now I cannot easily recover my binary. Now my binary really lives or somewhere in the memory, but I cannot do that really simple trick here. So, yes, blue team have to work more, but now we come to the blue side. And that's also the point. Why is it harder to investigate? Because when everybody said it's hard to investigate, no, we still have the memory. So the file lives still in the memory. It's not just gone from the file system. It might be gone from a file system, but if the file is still running or the code is still running, it's inside the memory. And something in Linux, it's called /proc PID maps. Every process get mapped into the memory in Linux, and we see our malicious or not so malicious program mapped into memory. And so we still have chances to get it back. This time, ChatGPT was to great help, because what we are seeing here, you don't have to fully understand the code, is we just iterate over that map section, and we get all the memory sections back. We realign the memory sections to get a file back. So even if we are using that loaded trick and we try to hide our binary from /proc/pid/exe, we still can recover our binary just from the memory mapped regions in the /proc directory. And you see that's super, super powerful. Even when we are dealing with fileless memory attacks under Linux, it's not so complicated to do that trick or to get your file back. You can analyze it. It might be possible that you cannot start the executable because of relocating of the binary sections, but it should be enough that you could do a static analysis with IDA or your preferred reverse engineering tool. Coming to the last part here, and I'm good in time, bash history. I love that one here. So Hal Pomeranz, that's also one of the really, really famous. When you are working in that space, he's the Linux guru, and now he talks about anti-forensic as well. And he said, okay, as an attacker, just unset the history file, do export his file def null, just point the history file to the trash in Linux, and the blue team will not have a history. Or just do export his file size 0, and the bash history will not get collected. Because every time I'm typing a comment in a Linux, in a bash prompt, that get also saved to the bash history, or most times at least. The thing is, even if you are typing these comments, they do not get written back to file, but they get recorded in memory. So as an attacker, even if I pop a shell, even if I log into SSH, into your server, and I enter these comments and I think I'm fine with it, your comments still get recorded in memory. This one here is one of now she's my co-worker, my team colleague. When new people want to work in our team, in our incident response team, they must do a little challenge, so a Linux challenge. And one of these challenges, Katarina solved it so well. She came, the first thing she did when I gave her access to the Linux host was dumping the memory. And then she said suddenly, yeah, it's super easy. I saw the first comment when setting up the challenge was unset his file, but I still, with the help of volatility, the memory forensic frameworks, I could dump the whole history you typed on the shell easily. So it's just such a quick win. Even if the attacker, when you see here, I might be clever as an attacker, I just export his file size 0, that no traces were recorded in the bash history. With the help of the memory dump of the Linux server, it's really, really easy to find traces. Every single comment I entered. The thing here is, and that's the key takeaway for the next few slides, is in order for volatility to find the bash history, you must tell volatility exactly how a bash history looks in memory. It's not just out of magic that volatility can find the history in memory. Memory is complex. It's a really famous book, The Art of Memory Forensic, which is 600 to 700 pages long. It's a super amazing read, but it showcases how difficult it is, the memory forensic part. The thing here is, volatility has a plugin, and the developers of volatility exactly described how a bash history looks in memory. So the volatility, the framework, is able to find it in memory. A stealthier, now again purple slide is, if I would pop a box, I probably would just start VI, and then within VI, I escape to a shell, but not a bash shell, but SH. So the really old shell, because the thing here is that shell, that SH, doesn't have a volatility plugin, and it's not covered by this one here. Just keep that in mind, just because somebody took the time to really carve out how the bash history looks in memory and put that into code, we were able to find traces of an attacker. But nobody took the time to do it for the SH. So your memory forensic will not work here. Or you might will get lucky if you're just searching for keywords, just doing grep, whatever, in the memory space, might get lucky, might get not lucky. And this is that's the last slide, this is from CrowdStrike, amazing read, because somebody said, and this one is not open sourced, so the author of that blog post, I contacted him and I said, amazing read, because what he did was like I said, he analyzed several shells, like the tickle shell, like SH, like also the Z shell, and he looked into that shells, how they are reflected in memory, and he wrote a tool for the EDR sensor of CrowdStrike. And he doesn't open source it because most probably it's the work of his employee, or back in the days, his employee. When you're reading that blog post, this is advanced stuff. So you must have a really good knowledge about memory forensics, about memory and operating system stuff, and just raising the bars for us blue teamers, because when you are using a different shell, like Z shell, like SH, we might not be able to find you as a red teamer. And this makes really the difference. And that's why I'm saying it's not impossible to find traces of an attacker, but it might just be harder. But anyways, who knows that tricks? Because most of the attackers, 90%, they're just using the bash shell, and we get lucky anyway. Hey, 8 minutes for questions if you have. Thanks for attending this talk.
So, thank you very much. Any questions?
Beer? Yes, I know you want one too.
Maybe just a side note, but in Bash you can simply prepend a white space, and then nothing will be logged into the history. It's meant for administrators. Exactly. When you enter passwords or something, you can simply do this really easy.
Exactly. Only in the bash history, but it's still reflected in memory. It is? Okay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a neat trick, but it's the same as just exporting the HISP file. It still get into memory, because just 30 seconds, because your bash history will get written to disk if you log off. Until you don't log off, your bash history will not get written to disk, so the bash doesn't know what you are pending to do.
One more question. The tools you showed us, will they just delete the files, or will they wipe the files? Because if you just delete the files, you can restore it.
Exactly. When they delete, it might depend. When they delete the file, we might be able to recover it.
I'm talking about these anti-forensic tools that delete files. Do they just delete the files, or do they wipe it? Do they overwrite the file?
At least they claim it. The anti-forensic tools I looked at, they claim they will repeatedly overwrite the data. Yep.
Any more questions?
But again, it might be enough that you find traces of execution of a tool. Then you can say, at least I know that somebody was on the system.
All right, then, thanks again. Oh, sorry, I missed you.
Still poking at the memory question. Once I've reached my objective, if I then just crash the PC, shouldn't I be rid of the memory issue? I mean, yes, it's not the most elegant way out, but I should eliminate the last traces.
Exactly. That's one of my research I have planned, because I want to do with my manager to create a memory forensic course. And one technique I'm thinking of, I want to research is what happens if I load a kernel module into the kernel? Do I have access to that memory? Can I actively search for that bash history in memory and then just mangle with the memory? Or just trying to crash the machine? Yes, that might be possible.
Anyone else? All right. Thanks again, Stefan, for your presentation.
Thank you.